Her father handed her to a stranger for a winter's firewood and a slab of bacon. The bacon was still warm from my smokehouse when he put her hand in mine. That's the part that stays with me. How that slab of pork was still giving off heat through the burlap like it had just come off the hook that morning, which it had. And there was his daughter, standing in the yard mud with her eyes forward and her jaw set, and her father not looking at her at all, just looking at me. His name was Josiah Cutter, a placer miner who'd worked the creek beds north of the Powder River for 6 years and had less to show for it than when he started. I'd traded with him twice before. He was a thin, defeated sort of man who smelled like creek water and tobacco, and that morning he had his hat in his hands, and he was turning it by the brim and not meeting my eyes. He said the firewood and the bacon would see his family through. Said he had 3 smaller children and a wife who was down with something that wasn't getting better. Said he didn't have another way. I had bought and sold a lot of things in my years on the frontier. Horses, hides, tools, seed, flour, ammunition, whiskey. I had never bought a person, and I told him so, straight out, standing there with his daughter's hand in mine and the October wind coming off the ridge with real teeth in it. He said she wasn't being sold, said she was being placed. Said I was a man of means and a man of good standing, and she'd be better off than staying in a camp where the children were already thin. I looked at her then, first real look. She was maybe 19, maybe 20, hard to say. Lakota on her mother's side, I could see that in the shape of her face and the way she held herself, upright and contained like she was braced for something, but damned if she'd let it show. She had on a wool dress that was too light for the weather, no coat, boots that had been resoled twice at least. Her hair was braided over one shoulder. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She was looking at a fixed point about 6 inches past my left ear, and she was waiting to see what the world was going to do to her next. I'd been on my own for 11 years by then. Since Margaret, and I hadn't minded it much or had convinced myself I hadn't. My place up on the Horseshoe Creek bench was decent, 2 rooms, a proper chimney, barn in good repair, a spring box that ran clear even in August. I trapped and traded, and I kept to myself, and that had been enough, or I'd made it enough. There's a difference I didn't examine too closely. I let go of her hand, not unkindly, just set it loose. I told Josiah Cutter to take his wagon and go. Told him the wood was already stacked at the end of his drive and the bacon was a gift, not a trade. Told him if his wife needed doctoring, I knew a man at Fort Fetterman who could help, and I'd send word. He looked at me like I'd spoken to him in a foreign language. I told his daughter she had 2 choices. She could go with her father or she could stay. That if she stayed, she'd have her own room and her own space, and I'd want nothing from her that she didn't freely give. That I worked hard and I kept my word and I didn't drink. That in the spring, if she wanted to go, I'd take her wherever she wanted to go myself and ask nothing in return. She looked at her father. He was already turning back to the wagon. She stayed. Her name was Winona. She told me that first night at supper, when I put a plate in front of her and sat down across the table, and we ate a meal together for the first time. She said it quietly, watching me, like she was offering something small and testing whether I'd be decent about it. I told her mine. Clarence, I said. Most people called me Clay. She nodded. We ate. I had put together a decent meal given the notice, salt pork and dried beans and cornbread, nothing special, but there was plenty of it and it was hot. She ate steadily without speaking, and I noticed she kept her eyes moving, not nervously, not like she was scared, but like she was cataloging. The room, the shelves, the door placement, the 2 windows, where the axe hung by the back door, where the rifle was. After a while she said, "How long have you been here?" I said going on 7 years. She said alone the whole time. I said yes. She went back to eating. I went back to eating. The fire did what fires do. I washed up after and she helped without being asked, and then she went to the back room and closed the door. and I sat by the fire a while and listened to the wind come down off the ridge and thought about what the hell I'd just done and whether it was foolish. I decided it wasn't. I'd made the offer and she'd made the choice, and we were both adults, and that was how things were going to proceed, plainly and honestly. I wasn't a man who confused what he wanted with what someone else owed him. I went to bed. She was a good observer, I'll say that first. The way she moved through those first days, quiet and watchful, tracking every habit I had. Where I kept the axe, which boards in the floor had give, what hour I came in for dinner. She wasn't hiding, and she wasn't creeping around afraid. She was learning the territory the way an intelligent person does when they arrive somewhere new and aren't sure yet whether it's safe. I recognized it because I'd done it myself once in a town where I was new and didn't know the customs or who was square and who wasn't. She slept in the back room with the door latched, and I never tried it. Not once. She'd understand that in time, or she wouldn't, but it was the truth of things regardless. The first week she stayed mostly to herself, took over the washing without being asked, did it thoroughly, hung everything straight, brought it in before the cold set into it. I noticed but didn't make a fuss of it. She'd learned soon enough I wasn't keeping a ledger. The second week there was a problem with the spring box. A beaver had worked his way up the creek and dammed a secondary channel, and the flow was starting to back up. I was clearing it out, knee-deep in water that was probably 35 degrees, when she appeared on the bank with a length of rope I hadn't thought to bring, holding one end and waiting. I looked at her. She held up the rope and raised her eyebrows just slightly, like, "Do you want this or not?" I took the rope. I tied it to the main branch blocking the works, and she braced herself on the bank, and we put our weight into it from two directions, and the thing broke free, and the water came through clean. My hands were shaking with cold by the time I climbed out, and without a word, she went inside and came back with dry wool socks she'd heated near the stove. I pulled them on and sat there on the porch step in the November air and looked out at the creek and didn't say anything for a while. Then I said, "Thank you." She said, "You keep a good spring box." Then she went back inside. That was the first time I heard her say anything like a compliment, and it landed like a stone in still water. I sat there a minute longer than I needed to, turning it over. The nights got colder and the trapline got more productive, and I fell into the rhythm of a working winter. Up before light, fire going, out to the line by first gray, back by mid-morning. She was always up before me. I never understood when she slept. The fire was always going when I came downstairs, and there was always coffee on the stove. She was quiet in the mornings. So was I. We worked in that quiet with no friction to it, and I came to appreciate it more than I knew how to say. There's a kind of silence that's comfortable and a kind that's heavy, and the one we had was comfortable from early on. Two people who didn't feel the need to fill the air to prove they were there. She sewed in the evenings mostly. She'd brought some things in that pack of hers, a small kit, thread and needles and scraps of good wool, and she made use of them. She repaired 3 of my shirts and a pair of trousers without mentioning it, just left them folded where I'd find them, and the work was better than what I could have paid for at the trading post. I thanked her, and she said it was something to do with her hands. I said I was glad she had it then, because the shirts needed it. A corner of her mouth moved. I wasn't sure for a few days whether that was a smile or just a tick, but it happened enough times in the right situations that I decided it was a smile. Small and controlled like everything else about her, but there. By December she was cooking most of the suppers. She didn't ask to, just started. And she could cook not soft food, not what I'd have made, but good. She knew things to do with dried corn and salt meat that I wouldn't have thought of. She had herbs in that cloth bag of hers that she used with precision. A pinch of one thing, a careful measure of another, and the results were better than what came out of my hands by a margin that was frankly a little humbling. She made a soup once with wild onion, and the smoked haunch of a deer I'd taken in November that I ate 3 bowls of and felt foolish about but couldn't help it. She caught me with the 3rd bowl and didn't say anything, just looked away, but I think she was holding back something that might have been satisfaction. I started timing my chores around dinner, not consciously, it just happened. That's how it starts, I think, not with anything you'd call romantic. Just with the sound of someone else in the house, with the smell of wood smoke that isn't yours, the shape of a second person moving at the edge of your vision when you come in from the cold. You live alone long enough and you forget how much of yourself you've boxed away to manage it, how much you've turned down and shuddered and taught yourself not to reach toward. Then there's someone there, and the boxes start to come unsealed whether you invited it or not. I didn't let on. I wasn't sure what I was feeling was anything other than gratitude for company. And I didn't know yet what she felt about any of it, except that she stayed and she worked. And sometimes in the evenings she sat on the other side of the fire and sewed, and didn't seem to need to fill the silence, which was a quality I had always valued in a person and almost never found. January came down hard. 4 days of blizzard that kept us both inside, and the second day I ran out of conversation topics, such as they were. She beat me at checkers 3 times running. The 3rd time I think she deliberately let me get close before closing the game off, which was a kind of mercy I hadn't expected and didn't know how to name. The 4th day of the blizzard she got out a piece of paper from her things pressed flat, carefully kept, and she drew something on it with a stub of pencil and slid it across the table to me. It was a map of my property. She'd walked enough of it by then to have the main features right, the bench edge, the creek line, the spring box, the barn and outbuildings. She'd put in the fence lines and she'd marked 2 spots on the creek bank that I recognized as beaver sign I'd been meaning to address, and she'd put in a 3rd location farther up that I didn't recognize. I asked her what that 3rd mark was. She said there's a 2nd spring up there. She said it was seasonal, probably dry in August, but it ran from snowmelt into June and it was coming from a good shelf of rock. She said if I ran a line from the main spring box up to catch that flow, I'd have more pressure in the summer. I stared at the map. I'd been on that ground for 7 years. I said, when did you find that? She said 3rd week, before the snow got deep. I said, why didn't you say something? She looked at me with that level look. She said, I wanted to be sure first. I thought about what that meant, about a woman being careful with what she said until she was certain of it, because she'd learned that saying the wrong thing in the wrong place cost you. I thought about what kind of life teaches that kind of caution. I said, you can tell me things when you're not sure yet. I'd rather hear a maybe than miss something. She considered that, then she nodded. We kept playing checkers and she won again, and I decided I'd start accepting it as a fact of life. I knew more about her by then. Not from her telling me directly, she didn't do that, not yet, but from the edges of things she'd let fall when the conversation moved that way. Her mother had died when she was 12. She'd been raised after that mostly in the mining camps her father dragged the family through, one after another, the promise of color always in the next creek, the next range, the next season. She'd learned English early and Lakota from her mother's sister when she could manage visits, and there was a 3rd language that was neither, which was how she moved in the world, watching everything, trusting slowly, not owing anyone anything she hadn't chosen to give. She asked me once, on the 3rd day of the blizzard, what had made me come to this particular piece of ground. I told her the truth, that I'd been a deputy marshal for 8 years in 2 territories, and one morning I woke up tired of the whole machinery of it, not the law, just the machinery, and I'd ridden until I found a spring that ran clean and a bench that faced south and had a good view of the approach, and I'd stayed. She thought about that, then she said, you still watch the approach. I hadn't realized she'd noticed. I said I supposed I did. She said she noticed because she did the same thing. We looked at each other over the checkerboard in the lamplight, and then she looked away first, but not quickly. She just looked away, easy and unhurried, like there was nothing that needed to be said about it. There wasn't. But something had been said anyway. The blizzard broke and the cold settled in for real. That particular dry iron cold that comes off the high country in January and makes the air feel thin and close and every sound carry too far. I was running the trapline 3 mornings a week, 4 hours round trip if the creek ice held, and I'd come in with my hands numb and my back stiff from the cold and the work, and she started having coffee ready when I came in. Not asked to, just did. It was the kind of thing a woman does when she's decided something, even if she hasn't said what it is yet. I wasn't about to push at it. One morning in late January I came back from the line earlier than usual. The second beaver set had pulled loose from the anchor and I'd cut my losses and turned back. She wasn't in the main room. The fire was burning well, her mending was on the chair, the coffee was on the stove. I heard her in the barn. I went out and she was down in the far stall with my old roan mare, who'd been off her feet the night before. She was talking to her in a low voice, not English, not quite Lakota either, and she had her hands on the mare's neck and the mare's head was dropped and easy in a way I hadn't been able to get it. I stood in the barn door and watched. She heard me there and looked over her shoulder, then she looked back at the horse. She said, "There's something in the left front." Not the hoof, higher. I came in and crouched down and ran my hand up the leg and found it, a small hard swelling just above the fetlock. Not serious if we caught it here. I'd need to poultice it. She already had the poultice. She'd made it from dried herbs she kept in that cloth bag she'd arrived with, and she was boiling the mixture in a tin on the small stove I kept out there for cold work. She'd been at it for a while already. I looked at the poultice, I looked at her. I said, "How'd you know how to make that?" She said, "My mother's sister kept horses." Then she handed me the tin and held the mare's head steady while I applied it, and neither of us said much else for a while. Just worked. The mare stood for it good, and by the time we were done, she was bearing weight again on that foot, and I was going to lose maybe a week off her recovery, instead of the month I'd been afraid of. When we came in from the barn, she poured coffee without being asked, and I sat down and I thought about what it was to have someone beside you who could see a problem and move on it, who didn't need to be told, who just did the thing. I'd had a partner once, years back on the Marshal's service, a man named DeVere, good man, steady as stone, the kind who covered your blind side without you asking and without wanting anything for it except that you were both still alive at the end of the day. I'd trusted him with everything I had and I hadn't had anything like that since. Not exactly. This was different, she was different, and I was different, and we were in different circumstances. But it was in the same family of feeling. That sense of a person who sees what needs doing and does it and doesn't need the credit for it. I didn't say any of that. I drank the coffee and thanked her for the horse and that was all. But it was there. February. Her father came. He came on a gray afternoon with the sky the color of slate, riding a horse that wasn't in much better shape than he was, and he came into the yard and didn't get down, which told me everything about what kind of visit this was. I was splitting wood when I heard him coming, and I set the axe down and stood. He looked around the yard. He looked at the stacked cord wood, the repaired fence line, the snow cleared away from the barn door and the house door both. He looked at the smoke coming from the chimney and the chickens in the pen I'd built back in the fall. He looked at all of it the way a man looks at something he's lost the right to have an opinion about. He said the children were all right now, said his wife had improved, said he'd found some color, a hint of it, up a tributary enough that he was heading back up there in the spring, said he supposed he should come by. I said I supposed he should. He said, "How's she getting on?" I said she was fine. I said she'd been a help to me and I expected she was well. He said she happy. I said that was something he'd have to ask her. He looked at the house. The door was closed, she hadn't come out. He sat on that horse for a while and I stood there and let the silence run because it wasn't my silence to fill. The wind moved through the yard and the horse stamped once. He said, "I know what I did." I let that sit. He said, "I didn't know another way." I said, "I know you didn't." Then I said, "She's not a thing to be handed, Josiah. She wasn't then and she isn't now." He took that, didn't argue with it. He had the look of a man who'd been arguing with it himself for 4 months and hadn't won. He said, "Is she going to come out?" I said I didn't know. I said that was her call to make. He waited another few minutes. The door didn't open. He turned the horse around finally and rode back the way he'd come, and I watched him go until he was out of sight past the tree line, and then I turned around and she was standing in the doorway of the house, her arms folded, watching the place where he'd gone. Neither of us said anything about it. That night at supper she ate quietly and I didn't push at anything. Afterward she sat down by the fire, and after a while she said, without looking up from her sewing, "He loves us the only way he knows how." I said I supposed that was true of most men. She looked up at that. I said, "Doesn't make every way a good way." She held my eyes for a moment. Then she nodded once slow and looked back down at her work. That was it. But it was the first time I felt like she'd put us in the same room, not in the same camp, not in the same transaction, but the same room, looking at the same thing together. Some weeks pass, and there's nothing to mark them, and some weeks have a thing in them that stays. The week she got sick was one of those. Midway through February, a cold that had been going around the valley caught up with her. She came down with it fast, the way healthy people sometimes do. One morning she was fine, by afternoon she had a fever, and by evening she was in bed and the fever was climbing. I am not a man who panics easy. 11 years alone on a frontier bench cures you of panic, or it cures you of the frontier. I knew fevers, I knew what to watch for, and I knew the difference between a fever that breaks in 3 days and one that doesn't. I sat with her most of that first night, keeping the fire up, getting water into her when I could. She was half out of it, and when she was conscious she didn't like being tended to. I could tell by the way she'd try to sit up and wave me off, but she was too weak to make it stick. At some point past midnight she said something in Lakota, not much, just a few words, low and slow like she was talking through gauze. I couldn't make it out. I said in English that she was going to be all right, that I had her. She went quiet after that. By the 3rd morning the fever broke, and she slept 8 hours straight and woke up thin and pale, and irritable in the specific way that means a person is mending. She didn't eat much that day, but she drank the broth I made, and she kept it down. In the afternoon, when she was strong enough to sit up, she said, "You stayed up with me." I said I did. She said, "You didn't have to." I said, "I know." She looked at me for a moment. Something in her face that I couldn't read entirely, but some of it was surprise, and some of it was something else, softer than surprise. She said, "Thank you." I said, "You'd have done the same." She considered that. Then she said, "Yes, I would have." And we both understood something in that exchange that neither of us chose to make explicit yet, but it was there. March came in brutal and went out soft, the way March does in that country. The creek came up and there were 2 weeks where I had to reroute my morning water run around a submerged section of bank, and she figured the reroute with me, walking the property line in the mud, pointing out where the ground held. She had a good eye for ground, better than mine in some ways. She read the way water moved through land the way some people read text, naturally, without effort, like the information was just there for anyone who knew to look. I told her so. She looked at me like she wasn't sure what to do with a straight compliment. Then she said, "My mother's people read the land. I'm reading what she gave me." I said that was a good thing to carry. She said some of it got lost. She said it plain, not grieving it, just naming it the way you name a loss that's old enough to live with. I said some of it didn't. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the water moving through the new channel we'd built up with stones. Then she said, no, some of it didn't. We rerouted the waterway that afternoon. I did most of the digging and she managed the redirecting stones, choosing each one with that deliberate care she brought to everything. And it took till nearly dark, but it held, and we came in dirty and cold and tired. And I built up the fire while she started supper. And somewhere in there, in the warmth and the smell of food, and the creak of the house settling against the cold outside, the rightness of it just settled into me like a stone finding the bottom. I was 52 years old. I had not expected this. April brought traders through. I did 2 days of business at my bench, buying hides and some early beaver catch from men coming down out of the higher drainages, selling tools and seed and salt. Winona handled herself with those men in a way that told me she'd had practice. Not aggressive, not soft, just present. She took their measure and they took hers, and by the end of the first day the ones who'd looked at her sideways at the start were talking to her straight. One of them, a gray-haired man named Ferris who ran 3 pack strings up along the border country, pulled me aside on the second afternoon. He said, "That woman of yours knows horses." I said she did. He said, "She told me the roach on my lead pack horse wasn't mange, it was sand. Said I needed to change my campsite and switch my grooming kit. Said she could tell by the pattern." I said she was probably right. He looked at me for a moment, then at her, then back at me. He said, "You're a lucky man, Harlan." My name isn't Harlan. He'd gotten it wrong, but I didn't correct him because I was thinking about the lucky part. I said, "I know it. What I keep coming back to is this. She arrived in my yard with a pack that weighed 15 pounds, and she had nothing, no family who was going to help her, no land, no money, no claim on anything. The world had handed her to a stranger for firewood and a slab of bacon, and she'd been left to make what she could of it. And what she made of it was this. She made this place better, not by being decorative or by filling a role, by bringing what she actually was into it, the knowledge and the steadiness and the eye for ground and the care for living things and the willingness to do hard work without being told to, and the patience to watch and learn before she spoke, and the spine to say the thing that needed saying when the time came. The first warm spell came in April, one of those weeks where the afternoons get into the 50s, and you can feel the year turning for real under the mud. I'd had a good spring. The trapline had run better than the year before. I had a buyer coming up from the fort for my hides, and I was about to add a lean-to off the east side of the barn, which I'd been planning for 2 years. She was helping me mark the post holes one afternoon, holding the line taut while I drove stakes, and she said, out of nowhere, "You told me last fall I could leave in the spring." I kept my eyes on the stake line. I said I did. She said, "Do you still mean it?" I said I meant everything I told her, always had. She didn't say anything for a moment. The wind moved through the new grass out past the fence line, and somewhere down the creek, there was a meadowlark making his own opinions known about something. She said, "What if I don't want to go?" I looked up at her then. She was holding her end of the line steady, not looking at me, eyes out on that same middle distance she had a habit of settling on when she was working something through. But there was color in her face that wasn't the cold, and her jaw was set in a way that said she'd worked up to saying that and wasn't sorry she'd said it. I said, "Then you don't go." I said it was never about going. It was about her having the choice. She said, "I know." Then she looked at me. She said, "I'm telling you the choice I'm making." I looked back at her for a long time. The wind, the meadowlark, the smell of turned earth and new grass, and the distant sound of the creek running full with snowmelt. I said, "All right, good." She let out a short breath that might have been a laugh or might have been something she'd been holding for 6 months. Then she pulled the line taut again, and I drove the next stake and we went on. That was it. That was how it happened. I will say one more thing about the lean-to. 3 days into building it, I was up on the wall frame cutting a notch for the cross beam, and I slipped. Nothing dramatic. My boot caught on a wet board, and I came off the frame sideways and hit the ground hard on my left side and lay there for a moment taking inventory. She was at my side before I'd finished that inventory. She crouched down next to me in the mud, and she didn't say anything and she didn't flutter. She just put her hand on my arm, steady, and waited. I said, "I'm all right." She said, "Let's make sure first." She ran her hands over my ribs, professional and calm, and I winced at one spot and she pressed it again and I winced again and she said, "There. Not broken. You'll be sore a week." She helped me sit up. I sat there in the mud with her hand still on my arm and I said, "That was a fool move." She said, "The board was wet. I saw it and I should have told you." I said, "I should have seen it myself." She said, "We'll do better." "Not you, we." I looked at her face, dirt on her cheek from kneeling in the mud and her hair escaping the braid a little from the morning's work, and her eyes on me with a steadiness that had no performance in it. Just there, just present, like she'd be there for however long this took. I thought about the woman she'd been in October, standing in my yard with her eyes fixed on a point past my ear, waiting to see what the world was going to do to her. I thought about the woman who was here now, kneeling in the mud with her hand on my arm, telling me we'd do better. Same woman, but this was who she'd been all along. The world had just kept her from showing it. She helped me up. We cleaned up the board and finished the frame that afternoon, slower and more carefully, and we didn't talk much, but the quiet between us had a warmth in it that was different from November. Later, maybe 2 weeks after that, we were sitting out on the porch in the evening, the first evening warm enough to sit outside after supper, and she was beside me on the bench with her hands in her lap, and the sky going orange and purple over the ridge. She leaned over and put her head on my shoulder. Not a dramatic thing, not an announcement, just a woman setting her head on a man's shoulder at the end of a long day as if it were the most natural thing in the world, which I realized sitting there it was, had been for a while. I didn't move, I didn't say anything. I sat there with her head on my shoulder, and the sky doing what April skies do, and I thought about 11 years alone, and about how you can talk yourself into thinking you're fine and believe it completely and still be wrong. About what you box away to make the loneliness manageable, and how long you can keep the lid on before you stop even noticing the boxes are there. After a while she said quietly, "You're a good man, Clay." I said I tried to be. She said, "You don't have to try that hard." I sat with that. I said, "You know better than me at this point, I suppose." She made a small sound, almost amused, and I felt it more than heard it. I said, "And you're a good woman, Winona, for whatever that's worth coming from me." She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "It's worth a lot, coming from you." We sat until the sky went dark and the first stars came out over the ridge, and the nighthawks came out over the creek, and the temperature dropped enough that her shoulder was warm against my arm, and neither of us moved or said anything else for a long time, and that was its own kind of plenty. The Lenta went up in May. She did more of it than I expected. She could set a notch, and I showed her the post-anchor technique once, and she had it the second time. My neighbor Aldrich came over to help with the main beam, a good man, taciturn, the kind who notices things and says nothing about them, which is the best kind. He watched the two of us work for about 20 minutes and didn't say a word about what he was seeing. On his way out, he clapped me on the arm once and said, "Good setup you've got here." That was all he said. It was enough. When he was gone, she said, "Is he a friend?" I said, "Neighbor first, friend second, same thing out here after long enough." She said, "He looked at you like you'd done something right." I said I supposed I had, finally. She looked at me sideways. I said, "It's not always been that simple, making the right call. I was better at the other kind for a while." She didn't ask me to say more, and I didn't. But that evening she sat closer to me than she usually did, and I thought that was its own kind of answer to something I hadn't asked outright. The summer she learned to shoot is a summer I think about often. Not because she needed to, I was there, and the place was settled enough that the need didn't arise. But I'd mentioned once, offhandedly, that the rifle was there, and she was welcome to learn it if she wanted to know, and about 3 weeks later she said she wanted to know. So I taught her. She came to it the way she came to everything, watching first, handling the rifle before she fired it, getting the weight of it familiar in her hands, asking questions that were specific and to the point. Not how does it work in the mechanical sense, but where does the eye go and how does the breath matter, and what does the trigger feel like just before it releases? I answered them straight. She wasn't asking to be taught, she was asking to understand. There's a difference. She shot well after 3 sessions. Naturally straight, steady breath, patient with the moment between settling and releasing that a lot of people rush. By the end of the summer, she was shooting better than men I'd known who'd carried rifles their whole lives. I told her so. She said, "You're a good teacher." I said, "You already knew how to be still. That's most of it." She considered that, then nodded, like I'd confirmed something she'd suspected. We shot together some evenings after that before the light went, at a target I'd set up against the hillside. Not with any particular purpose. Just because we both liked it and it was something we could do side by side, quiet and focused, the way some people play chess. Summer on the bench is a different creature than winter. The work doesn't stop, but it changes shape, longer light. More of it physical, out of doors and visible. You sweat instead of freeze and the creek drops and the grasses come up. And there's a smell to the air that you can't get anywhere else. Sage and pine resin and hot rock, that I've never been able to describe to anyone who hasn't lived in that country. She liked summer, I could tell. She moved differently in it, less braced against the cold, more room in how she held herself. She'd take her coffee out on the porch step in the mornings instead of drinking it inside, sitting there watching the light come up over the ridge with her face tipped toward it like she was storing it up. I was out there one morning doing the same thing, which is how I came to be sitting beside her when she said, "Do you ever think about going somewhere else?" I said I'd thought about it once or twice. She said, "Where would you go?" I said I didn't know. Said I'd thought about California once, years back. The coast. But by the time I got around to thinking about it hard, I'd already built too much here to leave easily. She said, "I used to think about going north, to where my mother's people are. Some of them are still up along the Tongue River country." I said, "Do you still think about it?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think about it differently now. I think about what it would mean to go there and come back, whether that could be a thing." I let that sit for a moment. I said, "I expect it could be. If you wanted to go, I'd take you. And if you wanted to come back after, there'd be something to come back to." She looked at me then, sideways, with that look she had that I'd learned to read, the one that wasn't quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of warmth. She said, "You'd take me yourself." I said, "Who else would I send?" She turned back to her coffee. After a moment she said, "Maybe next summer." I said, "All right." Neither of us said anything else about it, and it didn't need anything else. It was a plan made and agreed to with about 40 words, which was the way things got decided between us, without ceremony or fuss. There was a Sunday in late June where neither of us had anywhere to be and nothing that couldn't wait, which was unusual enough that we both seemed to notice it at the same moment and not quite know what to do with it. She made a bigger breakfast than usual. I fixed a hinge on the cellar door that had been annoying me for a month. We ate late and without hurry and afterward sat on the porch, and I read from a book I'd been working through for 6 weeks. I'm a slow reader, always have been. I find the words on the page and let them run at my own pace. And she sat beside me with her mending, and we passed a few hours that way in the sun, doing nothing that needed doing. At some point in the afternoon she said, "Do you know any songs?" I said, "A few." She said, "Sing one." I said, "I haven't sung in years. I'm not sure you want that." She said, "I'll tell you if I don't." So I sang, low and quiet, a thing I half remembered from when I was young, something about a river and a woman waiting and a man coming home. I remembered most of the words, but not all of them, and where I didn't I just hummed the melody. She listened with her eyes closed and her hands still in her lap. When I stopped, she didn't open her eyes for a moment. Then she said, "That was good." I said, "I lost half the words." She said, "I heard enough." I didn't sing again that afternoon. But she sat a little closer the rest of it, close enough that her arm was warm against mine, and the afternoon stretched out long and easy in the way that good Sundays do. And I thought, this is a thing I didn't know I wanted, and now I have it, and I don't intend to waste a minute of it. In July, I had trouble with a man named Caswell. He was a claim jumper who'd been working the area for 2 seasons, not mining himself but watching men who found good color, and then moving on their claims while they were away. He'd taken 2 men's claims that way and had a third going, and it started coming around my trading post asking questions about who was finding what where. I told him once flat that I didn't carry that kind of information, and I didn't intend to start. He came back a second time when I was away on the trapline, and she was there alone. She didn't tell me until that evening. She said it plainly. A man came by. This is what he looked like. This is what he said. This is what I told him. She told him I didn't carry that information and that he should move along, and he'd pushed at it a little, the way men do with women when they think there's no one to answer to, and she'd looked at him steadily and told him she'd be happy to remember his face when I came home and relay exactly what he'd pushed for, and he'd gone. I sat with that for a minute. I said, "You handled it well." She said, "I've handled his kind before." I said, "I know you have. That's not what I mean. I mean you handled it exactly right." She looked at me. I said, "Most people would have either run him off angry or let him push too far. You did neither." She said, "I read him. He wasn't dangerous. He was calculating. There's a difference." I thought about that. I said, "Where'd you learn to read men that way?" She said, "Mining camps. You learn or you get run over." I said, "Well, he'll be back with something different this time because you didn't give him anything to use. I want you to know that if you see him again, you send for me. Not because you can't handle him, but because I want to be there when it happens." She understood what I meant by that. She nodded. He came back as I'd expected 2 days later. He came into the yard while I was there, and when he saw me, he pulled up short and recalculated. I walked out to meet him, and I didn't say anything, just stood there in the yard with my hands at my sides and looked at him the way I'd learned to look at men who were calculating the odds. He read them correctly. He turned his horse and left and didn't come back. She came and stood beside me while I watched him go. After a while she said, "He'll find someone else to bother." I said, "Probably." She said, "You didn't say a word to him." I said, "Didn't need to." She looked at me for a moment, and then she said something that I've turned over many times since. She said, "You wear a lot of authority for a man who doesn't want to." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. She went back inside. I stood there in the yard another minute thinking about it. The hardest conversation we had was in August. She'd gotten a letter passed through 3 hands to reach her, the way letters do in that country, each person carrying it to the next on their route. Her father's wife had died. The children, her half-siblings, the 3 small ones, were alone in the camp up north with Josiah, who was not a man built to raise children alone. She read the letter at the kitchen table and put it down flat and sat with her hands in her lap and looked at nothing in particular. I read it when she offered it to me. I read it twice, then put it down. I said, "What do you want to do?" She said, "I don't know yet." I said, "Take the time you need." She didn't eat much that evening. She slept, or she was in the back room and quiet, which isn't the same thing. In the morning she was up before me, and the fire was going and the coffee was on, same as always. But her face had a look it got sometimes when she was carrying something heavy, still, controlled, but a weight behind the eyes. She said, "I want to go up there." I said, "All right." She said, "For a while, maybe most of September, to see what the situation is and what can be done." I said, "I'll take you." She said, "You don't need to take me, I can get there." I said, "I know you can." I said I wanted to go with her. Said those children deserved to see a man come with her, so that Josiah would understand she hadn't come alone and without backing. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "That means something, what you just said." I said it was just the truth. She said, "It's still something." We went. It took us 4 days up into the high country where Josiah had his camp, which was more a shanty than a camp by then, pushed up against a hillside with a creek to one side and not much else. The children were thin, the way I'd heard, but not sick. The oldest was a girl of about 11 who reminded me of Winona in the way she held herself, that same uprightness, that same reading of newcomers. She looked at me and she looked at Winona and she looked at Winona again, the second look longer, and whatever she saw there settled something in her. Josiah was as I remembered him, but more defeated. The loss of his wife had hollowed something out. He wasn't mistreating the children. He was just insufficient to them, alone, which is its own kind of problem. We stayed 9 days. Winona organized the camp, which had needed it badly. She worked with the oldest girl and they understood each other from the start. She spent time with the 2 younger ones, a boy and a smaller girl, reading what they needed and providing it with that same plain efficiency she brought to everything. I fixed what I could fix. The roof was bad and I re-roofed the worst of it. The stove pipe had shifted and I reset it. There were things that needed doing and I did them, because that was within my power and it needed doing. On the 7th day, Josiah came and sat with me outside in the evening, and we talked for the first time. Really talked, not the stilted exchange in the yard. He was a man in over his head in the permanent way, not the temporary kind, and he knew it. He said I should have done better by her, by Winona, I know that. I said, "You did what you could see to do." He said it wasn't enough. I said no, it wasn't. He took that. I said, "She's well, she's more than well. She built something with me and she built it herself with her own hands and her own choices. That came from her, not from anything I gave her." He thought about that for a while. Then he said the children would do better somewhere settled. He said he'd been thinking about trying again in one of the river towns, getting work rather than chasing the color. He said he didn't know if he had it in him, but he knew the current situation wasn't workable. I said I thought that was a correct read. He said he supposed he'd need help getting there. I thought about it. I said, "Write me when you're ready to move. I'll come help you move them." He looked at me. He said, "Why would you do that?" I said, "Because they're her family." He didn't say anything else for a while. The fire burned down between us, and the nighthawks worked the air over the creek, and somewhere out in the dark, one of the children laughed at something Winona had said, and the sound of it came through the camp quiet and easy and whole. On the 9th day we rode back south. We were a day out from the bench when she said, "Thank you for coming." I said I'd wanted to come. She said, "I know, that's what I'm thanking you for." We rode another mile or so and then she said, "The oldest girl. Her name is Clara." I said I'd noticed. She said she'll be all right, if Josiah does what he said he'd do. I said I thought she would be. She said, "She reminds me of someone." I looked at her. She was looking forward at the trail, the corner of her mouth doing that thing, just barely. I said I noticed that too. She said nothing else, and I said nothing else, and we rode the rest of the way home in the comfortable quiet that was by then as natural to me as breathing. That autumn I started on the second spring line she'd found from the map she'd drawn in January. It was a bigger project than I'd planned. The ground was harder than it looked from the surface, but by November we had a good run of pipe from the upper shelf down to the main box, and the pressure improvement she'd predicted was real. The flow in August would tell us how much, but even in October it was measurable. I stood at the spring box on the day we finished, and I looked at the water coming in, and I thought about a woman who'd walked my property line in her third week here, before the deep snow, before she knew whether she was staying or going, and had found this thing and kept it to herself until she was sure. Kept it because she'd learned to be sure before she spoke, and because she'd wanted to be useful, and because she didn't expect to be believed until she'd proved the thing. She was standing next to me, looking at the same water. I said this was a good find. She said it was a good bench, you picked good ground. I said you improved it. She said we improved it. There it was again, we, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I looked at her face in the late afternoon light. She was watching the water with that focused quiet she had, jaw easy, hair starting to silver at the temples which I'd only recently noticed, which told me I should have been looking more carefully, and I thought about the word, we. How long it had been since that word applied to anything in my life. How strange it had been at first, and how strange it was now that it had stopped being strange at all. I said Winona. She looked at me. I said I'd like to make this permanent, not just the water line, all of it, if you'd have me. She held my eyes for a moment. Not surprised. I didn't think she was surprised. She struck me as a woman who had known this was coming and had been deciding how she felt about it for some time and had decided. She said, I've been waiting for you to ask. I said, well, I'm asking. She said, then yes. She put her hand in mine this time, and it was the most different thing from October that anything could be. The same act, entirely different, because this time it was her choosing it. We stood at the spring box in the November air with her hand in mine and the water running clean, and said nothing else for a while. There was nothing else that needed saying. What I know is this. I was a man who had stopped expecting much from the years ahead. Not bitterly, I wasn't a bitter man, or I'd worked at not being one just practically. I'd had my measure of things and I'd come to the end of what I thought was mine to have. The work was good, the land was good, and if it was quiet, quiet wasn't nothing. I'd made something of it and I intended to keep making something of it, and someday I'd be done making things and that would be that. Then her father came into my yard with his hat in his hands and tried to make a trade of his daughter, and I wouldn't have it, and she stayed anyway. Not because she had nowhere else to go. She'd have gone back with him before she'd have stayed somewhere she was miserable. I saw that in her the first day. She stayed because she was a woman who made decisions with both eyes open and both feet on the ground, and she'd looked at me and the ground I kept and the way I conducted myself, and she'd made her calculation, and then she'd made her choice. And that choice, freely made by a woman with that much spine and that much sense, was the most valuable thing anyone had ever placed in my hands, more than any trade, any catch, any season I'd put together. Her choosing to stay, watching me through a hard winter, deciding I was worth it. It changed the quality of the years ahead, simple as that. There are mornings now I come in from the barn and she's at the stove and she hears me and looks over her shoulder. Just a look. And the look says, there you are, and it says, I know you, and it says, I'm glad you're back in. All of that in a look, no words needed. And I come in and pour my coffee and we talk about what needs doing that day or we don't, and either way is good. I built this place board by board out of a piece of ground nobody else wanted, thought I knew what I had, what I'd made. Turns out I'd only made half of it. She made the other half. And she chose to. That's the whole of it.